3. A summer wind stirs a western scape. Desert brush dancing under a sky of black. Thick storm clouds suffocate the rays tipping over the horizon. 5:29 a.m. 2. Caravans and coated men lay like sitting ducks, positioned and breathless. Dawn's now soon to come. 1. Hands hover, eyes unwavering. The unavoidable approaches now. When the first nuclear bomb touched American soil, July 16, 1945, it burned 10,000 times hotter than the surface of the sun. The scientists and researchers who witnessed the detonation that day described the blast as almost biblical. Red and orange clouds of billowing smoke burned through the sky, bathing the atmosphere in a purple glow. It was truly unlike anything they'd ever seen before. But what happens when inventions much like the atomic bomb, ones that are of such an unprecedented magnitude, are met with a history of greed and negligence? People die, lives are lost, made insignificant in the interest of those in power. For most of these, there is no official death count. There's no recognition or spotlight for the victims. Their lives remain another unnamed casualty. Beneath the buzz of victory that rang through the air post-World War II, there was an anxious optimism that hung over the US. The war was over. The bomb had been dropped. But what did any of this mean? For most Americans, it meant nothing. Their lives would continue. They'd go to school, to work. Nothing would change. For some, for those in power, it meant a newfound authority like no other. But for those witness and suffering the consequence of this new invention, it meant a danger unlike anything ever before. The initial explosion succeeded, but an inextinguishable fire had been lit. The Trinity test took place on unoccupied land in the desert of New Mexico, named Dead Man's Journey, just north of the original building site of the bomb, Los Alamos. The location was chosen carefully out of 8 possible sites. It was supposedly ideal. It was isolated and there was no population. But in actuality, it was far from any of those things. Just under 100 miles from the test site, a group of teenage campers awoke early morning to what they thought was a water heater explosion, but they were horribly mistaken. The sky filled with an orange light brighter than the sun. One of the campers that day, Barbara Kent, recalled white flakes falling from the sky just hours later. She recalled, "We were grabbing the white flakes and putting it all over ourselves, pressing it onto our faces." But the strange thing is, instead of being cold like snow, it was hot. And we all thought, well, the reason it's hot is because it's summer. We were only 13. We didn't know any better. Barbara Kent was the only camper that day to live to see the age of 30. The other campers likely died of complications due to radiation poisoning or cancers, but none of this was ever recorded. We don't have any official data of what actually happened. The scientists and researchers who tested the bomb that day weren't entirely safe either. They laid nearly 20 miles away from the test site, but the difference is that they were aware. The campers were not the only people victimized by the bomb. There were nearly 500,000 people living within a 150-mile radius of the test site. New Mexico civilians were never warned. Officials never sent out warning. They never evacuated the area as they were supposed to. The only word that they received after was that there had been an ammunition magazine explosion. Nothing of any real danger. Dubbed downwinders, the surrounding populations were victimized by Trinity. Infant death spikes, cancer rates rose. Some even developed radiation poisoning just after the detonation. But none of this ever reached mainstream media. The victims in Trinity suffered in silence because officials never did what they were supposed to do. There was a severe miscalculation of what was supposed to happen, and officials did not follow the proper protocol. They were aware of the possible danger beforehand, and they covered up what they did after. The guidelines that shaped the Manhattan Project and the building of the atomic bomb were defined by an earlier era known as the radium craze.
Busy you, in and out of doors every day. Think how much dust and dirt settle on your skin. And makeup clings to your skin too and clogs pores. That's why your face needs a thorough cleansing each day. And that's why cleansing tests were made by an independent testing laboratory. This same kind of dirt was made just radioactive enough to register on a Geiger counter.
Radium hit the U.S. markets like gold, just nearly 15 years after its discovery in 1898. Facial creams, health tonics, all sorts of things were made with radium. It was known as the healer of all, a liquid sunshine. Radium was a gift of the new century that never stopped giving. While health and beauty products had relevance, arguably the largest and most influential product at this time was something called Undark, a luminescent paint that was used in the manufacturing of clock dials. These dials were pivotal for war efforts. They skyrocketed in demand for aircrafts that would be flown at night, and the pilots needed something to be illuminated. Factories opened all across the US. They employed largely young women as painters, some as young as 14. These communities were incredibly close-knit in these factories. These girls often knew each other. They were friends. They were family. It seemed like the perfect job. There was high pay. The atmosphere was lively. There was incredible opportunity in this job, but this inadvertently condemned countless to death. The first victim of radium poisoning was Amelia Maggia. She died September 12, 1922, at just 24. Her sisters, Quinta and Albina, followed suit not much longer. Grace Fryer and Catherine Shaw also died of eerily similar causes. At the time, there was no name for this. There was no definition for the disease. All these girls had different diseases marked on their graves. But hundreds of girls kept dying. It likely got into the thousands, but there's no official data of how many died. So, how did this happen? The girls were taught to lip point when painting the dials. It was a technique in which the brushes were defined by placing the hair into their mouths, sharpening it to a fine point with their lips. Each painter was paid per dial. Most girls would finish around 250 dials per day. This would be thousands by the end of the week, and probably somewhere around 50,000 by the end of the year. Each day, they ingested radium with every lip point. And this radium compounded in their bones. It deposited itself, and it essentially decayed their jaws from the inside out. None of this, however, was completely accidental. The company employing these women, the United States Radium Corporation, was well aware of the dangers of radium. Painters worked in open studios. There were no safety precautions, nothing taken to protect these women. They had a mere paintbrush and rag. The chemists working in the exact same factories wore lead-lined aprons and had protective wear to protect themselves from this. USRC falsified reports. They lied to the workers about the dangers of radium, and the painters kept working. They kept lip pointing, completely unaware. The horror of what happened to the radium girls shaped the radiation safety guidelines that was used when building the atomic bomb. But, strangely enough, it didn't save the lives lost from the fallout. It only protected the scientists. The nuclear testing that would continue into the 1950s and 60s didn't establish improved standards. If anything, it weakened. Nuclear tourism was on the rise. People were encouraged to come watch the explosions. The death rate continued to rise. It wasn't just downwinders of Trinity now. The testing site was relocated to Nevada, where thousands of people died, and fallout carried winds throughout the entirety of the US and killed thousands of Americans. In recent years, there has been talk of bringing back nuclear testing. Project 2025 calls for rejecting the ratification of the Nuclear Comprehensive Treaty, which effectively banned all nuclear explosions in the 90s. This is a severe threat to us, and many policymakers now are urging for this to be followed through with. When we look back at the lives that were lost, we ask ourselves, how did this happen? And we tell ourselves that this will never happen again. But how do we know that's true? How do we know that something like this won't happen again? We have to take action. We need education, advocacy, and we need to regulate the corporations and government that has allowed this to happen, as we are the only ones that can shape our future. Thank you.